The water closed over Sarah Thompson's head. Just as she realized this was how she was going to die. Alone and forgotten in the murky depths of the Concho River on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in June of 1877. She had been washing clothes on the riverbank, a mundane chore she had performed 1,000 times since arriving in San Angelo, Texas, 3 months prior. The hem of her best calico dress had slipped into the current, and without thinking, she had reached too far. The rocks beneath her feet, slick with algae and worn smooth by years of flowing water, gave way instantly. One moment she was standing upright, the next she was tumbling headlong into water that ran deeper and faster than it appeared from the shore. Her skirts, heavy cotton that had seemed so practical that morning, now dragged her down like iron chains. She kicked frantically, but the layers of petticoats twisted around her legs, binding them together. Her lungs burned as she thrashed against the current, her fingers grasping at nothing but water. The world above the surface seemed impossibly far away, a shimmering realm of light, an air she could no longer reach. Her vision began to darken at the edges, tiny spots of black creeping inward. This was it. This was the end. All the dreams she had carried west from Virginia, all the hopes for a new life after the war had torn everything familiar away from her, would die here in this muddy river. Nobody would even know what happened to her. The boarding house keeper would eventually rent her room to someone else. The few possessions she owned would be sold or discarded. Sarah Thompson, 22 years old, would simply vanish as if she had never existed at all. Then something solid struck her shoulder. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, hauling her upward with such force that her head broke the surface before she could process what was happening. She gasped, choking on air and water simultaneously, her body convulsing as she tried to draw breath. The arms tightened, pulling her against a hard chest, and she heard a man's voice close to her ear, low and urgent. "I have got you. Stop fighting me or we will both go under." She tried to obey, but her body would not listen. Panic had seized control of her limbs, making them flail uselessly. The man adjusted his grip, one arm banding across her chest just below her collarbone, and began swimming with powerful strokes toward the bank. She could feel the strength in his body, the way he moved through the water with confidence despite her weight and the pull of the current. Each kick of his legs drove them closer to safety. The journey seemed to take forever and no time at all. Finally, blessedly, her knees scraped against rocks and mud. The man lifted her bodily and carried her the last few feet, stumbling slightly as he hauled them both out of the water and onto solid ground. He laid her on her side in the grass, and she immediately vomited river water, her body heaving as it expelled the liquid from her lungs. He kept one hand on her back, steadying her, and she was dimly aware that he was breathing hard himself, gasping from the exertion of the rescue. When the worst of the coughing subsided, she collapsed onto her back, staring up at the cloudless Texas sky while her chest rose and fell in ragged rhythm. "You all right?" the man asked, and she turned her head to look at him for the first time. He was younger than his voice had suggested, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair plastered to his skull and water streaming down his face. His clothes, typical cowboy attire of worn denim pants and a chambray shirt, clung to a lean, muscular frame. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a startling shade of gray-green that seemed to look right through her defenses to something deeper inside. Those eyes were filled with concern and something else she could not quite identify. Relief, perhaps, or recognition, as if he had been waiting his whole life to pull a drowning woman from a river. "I think so," she managed to croak, though her throat felt raw and her entire body trembled with cold despite the June heat. "Thank you. You saved my life." "Saw you go under from up on the ridge," he said, nodding toward the rise behind them where the main road ran into town. "My horse about threw me when I kicked him into a gallop. Did not even think, just ran and jumped." He paused, studying her face with those remarkable eyes. "Name is James Lancaster. People call me James. Sarah Thompson." She tried to sit up and immediately felt dizzy, the world tilting dangerously. His hand was on her shoulder in an instant, supporting her weight. "Easy now. You just nearly drowned. Give yourself a minute." His touch was gentle, despite the calluses she could feel through her wet dress. The rough hands of a man who worked with horses and cattle and rope. He helped her into a sitting position and then, with what seemed like deliberate effort, withdrew his hand and settled back on his heels, giving her space. "You live in town, boarding house on Chadbourne Street, the one run by Mrs. Henderson." Sarah pushed her wet hair back from her face, suddenly mortified by how she must look, bedraggled and half-drowned like a stray cat. "I was washing clothes. My dress slipped into the water and I reached too far. It was such a stupid thing to do." "River does not care about stupid or smart," James said quietly. "It will take whoever gives it the chance. I have seen strong swimmers get pulled under when they misjudge the current. You were unlucky, that is all." He glanced at the scattered laundry still lying on the rocks where she had left her basket. "Let me get you back to the boarding house. You need to get into dry clothes and drink something warm. Even in summer, you can catch a chill after something like this." She wanted to protest that she could manage on her own, that she had been managing on her own since her father died at Appomattox, and her mother followed him into the grave 2 years later from grief and consumption. But the truth was her legs felt like water themselves, insubstantial and unreliable. When James stood and offered his hand, she took it without argument, letting him pull her to her feet. He steadied her when she swayed, one hand hovering near her elbow, ready to catch her if she fell. "What about your horse?" she asked, looking around for the animal. "Old Rusty knows to wait for me. He will be grazing somewhere nearby, probably wondering why his fool owner decided to go swimming fully clothed." There was dry humor in his voice, and Sarah found herself almost smiling despite everything that had just happened. James walked over to her laundry basket and began gathering the scattered garments, wringing out what water he could, before placing them back in the woven container. The domestic gesture seemed incongruous coming from a cowboy who looked like he was more comfortable with a lasso than laundry. But he performed the task with easy efficiency. They walked slowly back toward town, James carrying the basket in one hand and staying close enough to catch her if she stumbled. Water squished in Sarah's boots with each step, and her dress clung uncomfortably to her legs, but she was too exhausted to care much about discomfort. The afternoon sun beat down on them, already beginning to dry her hair into stiff, tangled waves. She was aware of curious looks from the few people they passed on the street, residents of San Angelo taking note of the drenched pair making their way through town. Small-town gossip being what it was, this story would be all over San Angelo by supper time. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door of the boarding house, her round face creased with concern. "Good heavens, Sarah! What happened to you?" "She fell in the river," James said before Sarah could answer. "Nearly drowned before I could pull her out. She needs dry clothes and something hot to drink, madam." The older woman's eyes widened, and she immediately took charge with the brisk efficiency of someone who had raised 6 children and buried 3 husbands. "Upstairs with you right now, girl. I will bring tea and blankets. You, young man, come inside and get yourself dried off. I will not have you catching your death after performing a heroic rescue." James hesitated, glancing at Sarah as if seeking permission. She nodded, suddenly not wanting him to leave just yet, though she could not have explained why. There was something about his presence that made her feel safe, anchored to the world in a way she had not felt since before the war. He followed Mrs. Henderson inside while Sarah climbed the narrow stairs to her second-floor room, each step requiring more effort than it should have. She peeled off her wet clothing with shaking hands, the fabric resisting her efforts to unlace and unbutton. By the time she had stripped down to her chemise, Mrs. Henderson arrived with an armload of blankets and a steaming cup of tea heavily laced with honey. The landlady helped her into a dry dress, a simple brown cotton that buttoned up the front, and wrapped a thick quilt around her shoulders despite the summer heat. "That cowboy is waiting downstairs," Mrs. Henderson said as she brushed Sarah's tangled hair with firm, motherly strokes. "Said he wanted to make sure you were all right before he left. James Lancaster, he said his name was, works for the Miller Ranch north of town. Good family, from what I hear. His father owns a small spread up near Paint Rock, but the boy wanted to make his own way. Been in San Angelo about 2 years now." Sarah sipped the tea, feeling warmth spread through her chest and belly, chasing away the lingering chill. "He saved my life, Mrs. Henderson. I would have drowned if he had not jumped in after me." "Then you owe him a proper thank you." The older woman's eyes sparkled with something that looked suspiciously like matchmaking calculation. "A young woman alone in the world needs friends, Sarah, good people she can rely on. And a man who will jump into a river to save a stranger's life. Well, that is the kind of person worth knowing." When Sarah finally made her way back downstairs, steadier on her feet but still wrapped in the quilt, she found James sitting awkwardly on the edge of a parlor chair, his own clothes still damp but no longer dripping. He stood immediately when she entered, relief crossing his face. "You look better," he said. "Got some color back in your cheeks. Thanks to you." She moved closer, clutching the quilt around her shoulders. "I do not know how to properly thank you for what you did. You risked your own life to save mine." He looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Any decent person would have done the same. But you are the one who did it." Sarah took a breath, making a decision that surprised her even as the words left her mouth. "Will you have supper with me?" "Here at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson sets a good table, and it is the least I can offer after what you did." James's eyes widened slightly, and she saw something kindle in their depths, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "I would like that," he said quietly. "I would like that very much." That supper marked the beginning of something neither of them could have anticipated. James arrived the next evening freshly washed and wearing what were clearly his best clothes, dark trousers and a clean white shirt with a string tie. He had even trimmed his hair, though it still curled slightly at the collar. Sarah wore her second-best dress, a dove gray cotton with a modest neckline and lace trim at the cuffs, and had spent an embarrassing amount of time arranging her hair into something resembling order. They ate Mrs. Henderson's pot roast and potatoes in the boarding house dining room, surrounded by the other residents, but somehow existing in their own private world. James told her about growing up on his father's ranch, learning to ride before he could properly walk, spending long days moving cattle across the endless Texas grasslands. His voice grew animated when he talked about horses, the way they moved and thought, and each had their own distinct personality. He spoke of the sky at dawn when he was out checking fence lines, the way the stars looked from a bedroll under the open sky, the satisfaction of honest work that left a man tired but content at day's end. Sarah found herself telling him things she had not spoken aloud in years. About her childhood in Virginia before the war, when her father had been a tobacco farmer with modest holdings and big dreams. About watching those dreams burn when Union troops moved through, taking everything that was not nailed down and burning what was. About her father joining the Confederate Army at 45, too old to be a soldier but too proud to stay home, and never coming back. About her mother slowly fading away after the surrender, as if she had decided that a world without her husband was not worth inhabiting. About making the decision to go west to Texas, where land was cheap and opportunities existed for those brave or desperate enough to seize them. "What were you planning to do here?" James asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. "In San Angelo, I mean. What brought you to this particular town?" "Honestly, it was as far as my money would take me." Sarah smiled ruefully. "I have been working as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations. I am good with a needle, and there are not many women here who have the time or skill for fancy work. I have been saving money, thinking maybe eventually I could open a proper dress shop. Women here might appreciate having someone who could make them a nice dress without having to order from a catalog and wait months for it to arrive." "That is a good idea," James said. "The town is growing. More families moving in all the time. A dress shop would do well." They talked until Mrs. Henderson began pointedly clearing dishes and banking the fire, a clear signal that the evening had grown late. James walked Sarah to the foot of the stairs, his hand lightly touching her elbow, a contact that sent unexpected warmth racing up her arm. "Could I call on you again?" he asked, his voice low enough that the words were meant only for her. "Not because you owe me anything for the river. Because I would like to see you again." Sarah's heart did something complicated in her chest, a flutter and squeeze that was not entirely comfortable but was not unpleasant either. "I would like that too." He came calling 3 days later, and then again the following week. They fell into a pattern, James visiting whenever his work at the ranch allowed. Sometimes they sat on the boarding house porch in the evening, watching San Angelo settle into twilight. Other times they walked through town, and James showed her places she had not yet discovered in the months she had lived here. The old fort, built back in the 1860s before being abandoned and then reoccupied. The spring that gave the Concho River its name, bubbling up from limestone rocks. The mesa north of town where you could see for miles across the rolling Texas landscape. July melted into August, the heat becoming oppressive, making everything move slower except for Sarah's growing feelings for James Lancaster. He was unlike any man she had known back in Virginia. There was an honesty to him, a straightforwardness that came from living in a place where pretense served no purpose. When he said he would be somewhere, he was there. When he made a promise, he kept it. And the way he looked at her, those gray-green eyes warming whenever she came into view, made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced before. It was on a September evening, with the heat finally beginning to break and the first hints of autumn touching the air, that James asked if she would ride out to the Miller Ranch with him the following Sunday. "I want you to see where I work," he said. "Meet some of the people I spend my days with. And there is something else I want to show you, if you are willing to ride out a bit farther." Sarah borrowed a horse from the blacksmith, a gentle mare named Daisy who tolerated her less than expert horsemanship with patient resignation. She wore her most practical dress and tied a bonnet firmly under her chin to keep the sun off her face. James met her at dawn, leading his own horse, the bay gelding he called Rusty, and they set out north as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The Miller Ranch sprawled across several thousand acres of rough grassland, dotted with mesquite and crossed by seasonal creeks. James introduced her to the other cowboys, a weathered collection of men ranging from teenage boys to grizzled veterans of the cattle trade. They were respectful but curious, eyeing Sarah with the frank assessment of men who rarely saw women in their workplace. The ranch house itself was a low-slung adobe structure, practical rather than pretty, built to withstand the harsh Texas weather. After a midday meal of beans and cornbread, James led her away from the ranch, riding west toward a line of low hills. They traveled for nearly an hour, the horses picking their way across terrain that grew gradually more rugged. Finally, James reined in at the top of a rise and gestured toward the valley below. "There," he said, and Sarah caught her breath. The land stretched out before them, a natural bowl cradled between hills, with a creek running through its center and cottonwood trees clustered along the water. The grass grew thick and green despite the late summer heat, nourished by the reliable water source. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, full of potential and promise. 160 acres, James said quietly. "I filed a homestead claim on it 6 months ago. Been working every spare minute I have, building a cabin, clearing land, getting ready. Another year of proving it up and it will be mine, free and clear. I have been saving my wages from the ranch, buying materials as I can afford them. It is not much yet, but it could be. With hard work and time, it could be a real home." Sarah turned to look at him and found him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Why are you showing me this?" James dismounted and came to stand beside her horse, reaching up to help her down. His hand spanned her waist, strong and sure, and he lowered her gently to the ground but did not immediately step back. They stood close enough that she could see the flecks of darker green in his eyes, the sun lines at their corners from years of squinting across open range. "Because I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since I pulled you out of that river and saw you look up at me like I had just given you the whole world instead of just your life back. I know it has only been a few months. I know I am just a cowboy with more ambition than money and a piece of raw land that is years away from being a proper ranch. But I am asking anyway, because life is too short and too uncertain to wait for perfect timing. Sarah Thompson, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on building something with me, right here on this piece of Texas?" Her eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, the kind that came from happiness rather than sorrow. She had come west expecting nothing, hoping for little more than survival and perhaps a measure of independence. She had not expected love, had not expected to find a man who would dive into a river for a stranger and then proceed to dive into her heart with equal recklessness. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, I will marry you." James let out a sound that was half laugh, half exhale of relief and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her there on the hillside, with the Texas wind blowing around them and the land they would build a life on spread out below. It was not her first kiss, but it was the first one that felt like a promise, like the beginning of something rather than the end. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church on the edge of San Angelo, with Mrs. Henderson and a handful of cowboys from the Miller Ranch as witnesses. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored cotton with lace at the throat and wrists, the best work she had ever done. James wore the same clothes he had worn to their first supper together, the string tie and clean white shirt, but he had bought a new hat for the occasion, black felt that he held nervously in his hands during the ceremony. The minister, an earnest young man named Reverend Porter who had only been in San Angelo for a year himself, spoke about faith and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. But the words that mattered most were the ones James said when it came time for the vows, his voice steady and clear as he looked into her eyes and promised to love her for all the days of his life, in sickness and health, in prosperity and hardship, until death parted them. Sarah promised the same, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They spent their wedding night in a room at the hotel, a luxury they could barely afford but deemed necessary for the occasion. James was gentle with her, patient in a way that spoke of genuine care rather than mere restraint. He seemed determined to make sure she felt cherished, that this first joining of their bodies was about more than simple physical need. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Sarah felt something inside her finally settle into place. The restlessness that had driven her west, the sense of being unmoored and adrift, had finally eased. She had found her anchor in this quiet cowboy who had pulled her from a river and offered her not just rescue but a future. The next morning they loaded Sarah's few possessions onto a wagon borrowed from the ranch and made the journey out to the homestead. The cabin James had built was small, just one room with a loft for sleeping, but it was solid and well made. He had chinked the logs carefully to keep out wind and weather, built a sturdy stone fireplace that would keep them warm in winter, fashioned a door that hung straight and true on leather hinges. There was not much furniture yet, just a table and 2 chairs he had made himself, a rope bed in the loft with a mattress stuffed with prairie grass, some shelves for supplies. But to Sarah, who had lived in a single rented room for months, it looked like a palace. They fell into the rhythms of homestead life with surprising ease. James continued working at the Miller Ranch several days a week, earning the money they needed for supplies and livestock. Sarah threw herself into making the cabin into a home, sewing curtains for the windows, planting a garden near the creek, learning to cook over an open fire, and then later in the cast iron stove James bought in November. She also continued her sewing work, and word spread that the new Mrs. Lancaster was skilled with a needle. Women from town and surrounding ranches began bringing her fabric and asking for dresses, shirts for their husbands, quilts for their beds. The extra income was modest but welcome, every dollar going toward building their future. Winter came, cold and occasionally bitter, but the cabin proved weathertight. They spent long evenings by the fire, James mending tack or carving while Sarah sewed, and they talked about everything and nothing. She learned about his childhood, about a father who was stern but fair, and a mother who had died when James was 12, leaving him and his 2 sisters to grow up under their father's rough care. He learned more about her past, the details she had glossed over in earlier conversations. The poverty after the war, the desperate years trying to keep her mother alive and fed, the moment she realized that staying in Virginia meant slowly dying there. "You miss it?" James asked one night in December as snow fell outside, rare but not unheard of in this part of Texas. "Your home?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I miss what it was before the war, the place I grew up in, the people I knew, but that is all gone now, destroyed or scattered. The Virginia I left behind was just a graveyard full of ghosts. This is home now. This cabin, this land, This is where I belong." He pulled her close, and they sat together watching the fire burn low, content in the silence and each other's presence. Spring arrived with wildflowers carpeting the valley in brilliant colors, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and black-eyed Susans turning the grassland into a living quilt. Sarah discovered she was pregnant in March, confirmed by the doctor in San Angelo after weeks of morning sickness that left her weak and miserable. James was overjoyed, his face splitting into a grin so wide it looked almost painful, and he became impossibly more protective and solicitous of her comfort. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said with amusement, when he tried to prevent her from carrying a bucket of water from the creek. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I am not going to break." "I know that," he said, looking sheepish. "But you are carrying our child, Sarah, our son or daughter. Let me take care of you both." She let him fuss, recognizing it for what it was. Love expressed through action, through the small gestures of care that made up the substance of their daily lives together. He brought her wildflowers he picked on his rides across the ranch. He traded work with a neighbor to get fresh milk from a cow, knowing she craved it. He built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there were no rough edges that could harm delicate baby skin. The baby came in November of 1878, a long, difficult labor that started just before dawn and lasted throughout the day and into the evening. Mrs. Henderson came out to the homestead to assist, having attended more births than she could count, and she moved around the cabin with calm efficiency while Sarah writhed in pain that seemed to have no end. James paced outside, helpless and terrified, until Mrs. Henderson finally called him in to meet his son just after midnight. The baby was red-faced and angry, wailing his displeasure at being forced into the cold world. But he was perfect, with a cap of dark hair and tiny fists that waved furiously in the air. James held him with such care, such reverence, that Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. This man who worked with 1,000-pound horses and ornery cattle, who could rope a steer and brand a calf and break a mustang, held their newborn son as if he were the most precious and fragile thing in existence. "Samuel," Sarah whispered, naming him after her father. "Samuel Lancaster." James looked up from the baby's face, his eyes shining with emotion. "It is perfect. He is perfect. You are perfect." He leaned down to kiss her forehead, still holding their son carefully. "Thank you for this, for him, for everything." The first year of Samuel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless chores, the work of maintaining the homestead complicated by the needs of an infant. But there was joy too, so much joy it sometimes threatened to overflow. Samuel's first smile, appearing at 6 weeks and directed at his father's face. His first laugh, a gurgling sound of pure delight when James bounced him on his knee. The way he grew and changed, transforming from a helpless newborn into a baby who could sit up, then crawl, then pull himself standing while holding onto the furniture. The homestead prospered as well. James completed his proving-up period and received the deed to the land, making it officially theirs. He bought their first cattle, a small herd of 20 longhorns that would be the foundation of their ranch. Sarah's sewing business grew, and she was able to buy a proper sewing machine that made the work faster and easier. They added a room onto the cabin, a separate space for sleeping that gave them more privacy and room for their growing family. Life was not easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, times when money ran short and worry kept them both awake at night. Cattle died, crops failed, equipment broke. But they faced each challenge together, and somehow that made even the difficult times bearable. James never failed to tell her he loved her, the words as natural to him as breathing. Sarah showed her love through 100 small actions, the way she mended his shirts and cooked his favorite meals, and made sure there was always coffee hot on the stove when he came in from working. Sarah became pregnant again in 1880, and this time the process was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their daughter arrived in February of 1881, during a cold snap that had James frantically keeping fires burning to ensure the cabin stayed warm enough. They named her Emma after James's mother, and she was as different from Samuel as night from day. Where her brother had been loud and demanding, Emma was quiet and observant, watching the world with wide gray-green eyes that were a perfect copy of her father's. The years flowed past, marked by seasons and milestones. Samuel started helping with small chores around the ranch, shadowing his father with serious determination. Emma learned to walk and then to run, chasing chickens around the yard and picking wildflowers to bring to her mother. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, the cattle herd expanding, more land put under cultivation. James hired occasional help during busy seasons, cowboys who worked for wages and moved on when the job was done. In 1883, Sarah realized the little dress shop she had dreamed about was not so impossible after all. She had saved enough money from her sewing to consider renting a small space in San Angelo, a real shop with a sign and set hours. She discussed it with James one night after the children were asleep, nervous about his reaction. "I think it is a fine idea," he said immediately. "You have been working toward this for years. The ranch is doing well enough that we can afford to take the risk. And you are skilled enough that I know it will succeed." She opened Thompson's dressmaking that spring, keeping her maiden name for the business. The shop was tiny, just a single room on a side street, but it was hers. She hired a girl from town to help watch the children when she needed to be at the shop, and slowly built a steady clientele of women who appreciated her skill and eye for fashion. The business would never make them rich, but it provided a steady income and gave Sarah a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with being a wife and mother. The ranch continued to grow as well. By 1885, James employed 3 full-time cowboys and ran a herd of nearly 200 cattle. He bought more land, adjacent parcels that expanded their holdings to over 500 acres. The original cabin became a kitchen and storage area when they built a proper house, a 2-story frame structure with real glass windows, and a parlor with a piano Sarah ordered from a catalog. It felt impossibly grand to her, this house on the land where she had once stood and listened to a cowboy propose marriage. Samuel, now 7, was his father in miniature, serious and responsible beyond his years. He could already ride as well as many grown men, and he understood cattle with an intuition that could not be taught. Emma, at 4, was quieter but no less determined. She followed her mother around the dress shop when she was allowed, fascinated by fabric and color and the transformation of cloth into clothing. Sarah sometimes stood on the porch of their home in the evening, watching the sun set over the land they had built together, and marveled at how far she had come from that day in the river. She had been drowning in more ways than one back then, lost and alone and uncertain of her future. James had pulled her out of the water, but he had done more than save her life. He had given her a reason to live it, fully and completely, holding nothing back. In the spring of 1887, James came home from town with news. The railroad was extending a line through San Angelo, which meant easier access to markets for their cattle and goods. Property values were rising. The town was growing, transforming from a rough frontier settlement into a real community with schools and churches and businesses. Their little homestead, the raw land James had shown her on that hillside 10 years ago, was now worth 10 times what he had paid for it. "We could sell," he said, sitting at the kitchen table while Sarah prepared supper. "Take the money and buy an even bigger spread, further out where land is still cheap. Really build something." Sarah turned from the stove to look at him, studying his face. "Is that what you want?" James was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "No," he finally said. "No, I do not think it is. This is our home. This is where we started, where our children were born. This is where I brought you after we married and where we have built our life together. I do not want to start over somewhere else. I want to stay here and keep building what we have already started." "Then that is what we will do." Sarah came to stand behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and resting her cheek against his hair. "I would follow you anywhere, James Lancaster, but I am glad we are staying here." He reached up to cover her hands with his own, and they stood that way for a while, comfortable in the silence and the knowledge that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Life continued its steady progression. Samuel grew tall and strong, taking on more responsibility around the ranch until he was doing the work of a grown man despite being only 12. Emma discovered a talent for drawing and began sketching the cattle and horses, capturing their forms with a skill that surprised everyone. Sarah's dress shop prospered, and she employed 2 full-time seamstresses to help with the increasing workload. James's reputation as a fair employer and skilled cattleman spread, and the Lancaster Ranch became known throughout the region as a well-run operation. In 1891, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise given that Emma was now 10 and they had assumed their family was complete. The pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, her body older and less resilient, but the baby arrived healthy in February of 1892. Another boy, who they named Thomas after Sarah's grandfather. Samuel and Emma doted on their baby brother, taking turns helping care for him and entertaining him with games and songs. The turn of the century found the Lancaster family firmly established as one of the prominent ranching families in the region. Samuel, now 21, managed much of the day-to-day operation of the ranch, allowing James to step back slightly and enjoy his hard-won success. Emma, at 18, had developed her artistic talent and was creating paintings that hung in homes throughout San Angelo. Thomas, at 8, was showing signs of being a scholar, always with his nose in a book and asking questions about everything under the sun. James turned 46 that year, his dark hair now streaked with gray at the temples, his face weathered by decades of Texas sun and wind. But when he looked at Sarah, his eyes held the same warmth they had the day he pulled her from the river. And when Sarah looked at him, she saw not just her husband but her partner, the man who had given her not just rescue but a purpose and a home and a family. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in October of 1898, hosting a party at the ranch for friends and neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, made the journey out from town to attend. The cowboys who worked for them organized a dance, bringing instruments and playing far into the night. Samuel danced with a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a pretty girl named Catherine who clearly held his interest. Emma spent the evening sketching the scene, capturing the celebration in flowing lines and careful detail. Thomas fell asleep on a pile of coats, exhausted by the excitement. After the guests had departed and the children were in bed, James and Sarah stood on their porch, just as they had 1,000 times before. The Texas sky spread above them, immense and star-filled, the same sky that had witnessed their courtship and marriage in all the years since. 20 years, James said softly, his arm around her waist. 20 years since I convinced the prettiest woman in San Angelo to take a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense. 20 years since a cowboy jumped into a river and changed my life, Sarah replied, leaning into his warmth. I was drowning, James, not just in the water but in everything. I had lost so much, and I did not know how to keep going. Then you pulled me out, and suddenly I had a reason to breathe again. I fell in love with you the moment I saw your eyes open and knew you would live, he said, a confession he had never quite articulated before. Standing there on the riverbank, both of us soaked and you coughing up water, and all I could think was that I would do anything to see you look at me like that again. Like I mattered. Like I was someone worth knowing. You are worth knowing, worth loving. She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. You gave me everything, James. A home, a family, a future I never dreamed possible. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." He kissed her then, deep and slow, a kiss that held 20 years of love and commitment and shared life. When they finally drew apart, both were smiling, the years falling away until they were young again, standing on a hillside while he proposed marriage and she said yes. Samuel married Catherine in 1902, a joyous wedding that filled the church in San Angelo with well-wishers. The young couple built their own house on Lancaster land, a smaller version of the main house, and Samuel took over full management of the ranch. James officially retired, though he still spent most days working alongside his son, unable to fully step away from the land he loved. Emma surprised everyone by announcing she had been accepted to an art school in St. Louis. She departed in the fall of 1903, the first Lancaster to pursue education beyond what the local schools offered. Sarah cried as the train pulled away, but they were proud tears. Her daughter was brave enough to chase her dreams, just as Sarah herself had been brave enough to board a westbound train and seek a new life in Texas. Thomas, showing every sign of living up to his scholarly promise, talked about becoming a doctor or perhaps a teacher. At 13, he was already helping tutor younger children in town, patient and clear in his explanations. The years continued their steady march. James and Sarah grew older together, their hair gray, their hands marked by age and work. But their love remained constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They had weathered droughts and floods, economic panics and personal losses. They had buried friends and celebrated victories, seen their children grow and begin building lives of their own. In 1907, Emma returned from St. Louis with a husband, a fellow artist named Richard Westfield who looked at Texas with wide Eastern eyes but who clearly adored Emma. They settled in San Angelo, where Emma opened a small gallery and Richard taught art classes. Samuel and Catherine presented James and Sarah with their first grandchild, a boy named James after his grandfather. Thomas, now 18, secured a scholarship to a medical school in Austin. James turned 55 that year, and Sarah threw him a birthday party that brought people from all over the county. As she watched him laugh with old friends and dandle his grandson on his knee, she marveled again at the life they had built. All of this, all of these people and this prosperity and this happiness, had started with one impulsive act of courage. A cowboy seeing a woman drowning and not hesitating, just running and diving into the river to pull her to safety. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, James found Sarah in the room they had shared for nearly 3 decades. She was standing at the window, looking out at the moon-silvered landscape, and he came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "Everything, all of it, how we got here." She covered his hands with her own, feeling the familiar calluses and strength. "I was thinking about the river, about that day. If you had been riding a different route, if you had been 5 minutes later, if you had not seen me go under. My whole life turned on that single moment, James. Our life together. I saw you," he said simply, "and I could not let you drown. It was not even a choice, really. It was just something I had to do. I know. That is who you are. That is who you have always been." She turned in his arms to face him, this man who had saved her and loved her and built a life with her. "I love you, James Lancaster. I have loved you for 30 years, and I will love you until I draw my last breath. And I love you, Sarah Lancaster. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, always." They stood together in the moonlight, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. Outside, the wind whispered across the grasslands, the same wind that had blown on the day they met. The land stretched away in all directions. Their home, their legacy, their piece of Texas that would endure long after they were gone. The river where it had all begun still flowed through the valley, its waters moving ceaselessly toward some distant sea. But Sarah no longer feared the current or the depth. She had learned to swim in deeper waters than the Concho River, had learned to navigate the currents of marriage and motherhood and building a life in an unforgiving land. And she had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, real love, was someone seeing you drowning and diving in to pull you to safety again and again, for all the days of your life together. Years continued to pass in their steady rhythm, bringing both joy and sorrow as all years do. Samuel and Catherine had 3 more children, filling the ranch with the sounds of young voices and laughter. Emma and Richard had twin daughters who showed early signs of their mother's artistic talent. Thomas completed his medical training and returned to San Angelo in 1912, opening a practice that quickly became essential to the growing community. James's father passed away in 1910, and they made the journey to Paint Rock for the funeral. It was strange for James to stand in the cemetery and say goodbye to the man who had taught him everything about ranching, about honor, about what it meant to be a man of his word. But there was comfort, too, in knowing his father had lived to see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, had witnessed the success James had made of his life. Sarah's dress shop remained a fixture in San Angelo, though she had long since turned over the daily management to her employees. She still went in several times a week, unable to fully relinquish the business she had built from nothing. But more and more, she was content to stay at the ranch, to tend her garden and watch the seasons turn and spend time with James. In 1915, James and Sarah celebrated their 37th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, just the 2 of them. Samuel had insisted they not work that day, that they take time to simply be together. So they sat on the porch in the evening, in the rocking chairs James had made years ago, and watched the sun paint the western sky in shades of amber and rose. 37 years, Sarah said softly. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like no time at all. I know what you mean. James reached over to take her hand, their fingers lacing together with the ease of long practice. But I would not trade a single day of it, Sarah, not one, even the hard times, the struggles and losses. It was all part of building this life together. No regrets. Not a single one. He squeezed her hand gently. No regrets. She smiled, the expression still lighting her face with the beauty he had first glimpsed on a riverbank decades ago. How could I regret anything that brought me here to this place with you? They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one, the vast Texas sky spreading above them like a benediction. In the distance, they could hear cattle lowing and the sound of Samuel's children playing before bedtime. The ranch house behind them glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming. This was home, this land they had tamed together, this family they had created, this love they had nurtured for nearly 4 decades. James turned 64 in 1917, and Sarah noticed he moved a bit slower now, that his breathing was sometimes labored after climbing stairs. She did not mention it, knowing her husband's pride, but she watched him carefully. Age was catching up with them both, the years finally extracting their toll. Her own hands ached on cold mornings, arthritis settling into joints worn by decades of sewing. But these were small prices to pay for the privilege of growing old together. The world was changing around them. America entered the Great War in Europe, and though the fighting was far away, it touched even their remote corner of Texas. Young men from San Angelo enlisted, including one of Samuel's hired hands. The newspaper brought stories of battles and casualties, of a world convulsed by violence that seemed incomprehensible to people who had built their lives on the land. But the ranch endured, as it always had. The cattle still needed tending, the horses still needed training, the work still needed doing. And James and Sarah still rose each morning to greet the day together, still shared their meals and their thoughts and their bed, still loved each other with the quiet intensity of two people who had chosen each other and never looked back. In the spring of 1920, they traveled to St. Louis to see Emma's first major exhibition at a prestigious gallery. Her paintings, large canvases depicting the Texas landscape and the people who inhabited it, drew crowds and critical acclaim. James stood in front of a painting of the ranch, looking at his daughter's interpretation of the home they had built, and Sarah saw tears shining in his eyes. "She captured it," he whispered. "Everything we worked for, everything we built." She saw it and understood it and put it on canvas for the world to see. Sarah slipped her arm through his, her heart swelling with pride. Their daughter, the little girl who had chased chickens and picked wildflowers, was now a recognized artist whose work would outlast them all. It was a legacy different from land or cattle, but no less valuable. They returned to San Angelo tired but happy, content to be back in their own home. James resumed his light duties around the ranch, still needing to feel useful to contribute. Sarah went back to her garden and her occasional visits to the dress shop. Life settled back into its familiar patterns. On a warm June morning in 1922, James did not wake up. Sarah found him lying peacefully beside her, his hand still resting on the pillow near her own, his face relaxed and calm. He looked younger in death, the lines of worry and work smoothed away. She did not scream or cry out. Instead, she simply took his hand and held it, sitting beside him in the early morning light, saying goodbye to the man who had been her whole world for 44 years. The funeral filled the church to overflowing, with people standing in the back and spilling out into the street. James Lancaster had touched many lives in his 69 years, and they all came to pay their respects. Samuel delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke of his father's integrity, his kindness, his unwavering devotion to family. Emma created a memorial card with a drawing of her father on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. Thomas spoke about the lessons his father had taught him about being a good man. They buried him in the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, in ground he had loved and worked and made flourish. Sarah stood at the graveside, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and said her own silent goodbye. He had saved her once, long ago, pulling her from a river when she was drowning. And in all the years since, he had saved her again and again simply by loving her, by building a life with her, by being the kind of man worth growing old beside. The months after his death were the hardest of Sarah's life. She had been alone before, after her parents died, but this was different. Then she had been lonely but free, unattached and responsible only for herself. Now she was surrounded by family, by people who loved her and wanted to support her, but she felt James's absence like a physical wound. The bed was too large, the house too quiet, the days too long without him to share them with. But gradually, slowly, she learned to carry the grief without being crushed by it. She found comfort in her children and grandchildren, in the continuation of the life she and James had built together. Samuel ran the ranch with the same integrity his father had shown. Emma's art continued to win recognition, her paintings hanging in galleries across the country. Thomas's medical practice saved lives and eased suffering. They were good people, kind people, and she and James had made them together. Sarah lived another 8 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in November of 1930 at the age of 75. Her children found her in the morning, lying in the bed she had shared with James, a smile on her face as if she were dreaming of something pleasant. Perhaps she was dreaming of a summer day in 1877, when a cowboy dove into a river to save a drowning woman and changed both their lives forever. They buried her beside James on the hill overlooking the ranch, and Samuel had a stone marker erected that bore both their names and the simple inscription, "Together in life, together in eternity." The ranch continued, passed down through the Lancaster generations, a testament to what two people could build when they loved each other and were willing to work for it. The original cabin still stood, carefully preserved, and the family told the story to each new generation, about how it all began with an act of courage and compassion. A stranger diving into a river without hesitation, pulling a drowning woman to safety, and then, impossibly, falling in love with her in the end. That was their legacy. Not just the land or the cattle or the buildings, but the love story that had started it all. The story of how Sarah Thompson, alone and drowning in more ways than one, was saved by James Lancaster, who gave her not just her life but a reason to live it fully. The story of how they built something lasting and true in the wild Texas landscape, something that would endure long after they were gone. And on summer evenings when the wind blew across the grasslands and the sun set in shades of gold and crimson, those who lived on the Lancaster ranch sometimes felt a presence, as if two spirits still walked the land they had loved. A cowboy and his wife, forever together, forever home.